little group that you're running here seems to have a lot of lumens.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us, comrades. Thank you for coming along to this latest webinar. This is in our sub-series on imperialism. We're very pleased to have with us Michael Roberts to discuss the question of the changing relationship between the US and China, which has gone something from containment to confrontation, perhaps, in the next few years. So that's a really interesting subject. There's loads to discuss. If you want to raise a point, you can do it after Michael has spoken. We've got some time for discussion and debate. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael. Take it away, please.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tina, and for everybody who is watching now. As you are aware, we have continual conflicts around the world at the moment, the latest one being in Syria, and these are military conflicts where people are dying and casualties rise by the thousands every week. But the big confrontation still to come globally, geopolitically, is between the United States and China. And I'm just going to give you a little account of why that's the case and how that's developed and what we can learn from it, because it's going to be the big issue of the rest of this decade, in my view. So I'm just going to share a few graphs with you, if I can. So it's what I feel is the geopolitical contradiction of the 21st century, the challenge that the US has now facing it from the rise of the Chinese economy and state to the size that it has over the last 40 years. So let me start by quoting the still President of the United States, Joe Biden, who said recently, China has the overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. I'm not sure if that's the case, but that's what he said. And then he finished by saying, that's not going to happen on my watch. So you'd have to ask yourself the question, in a world where people are freely trading and producing and generally getting on with their lives, how that could be stopped? In what way does he plan to avoid that? Is it a question of being better, being a bigger and more faster growing economy, a wealthier country than it is now, or a more powerful one? Is that how he's going to achieve it? But behind that statement by Biden is a fear that China will overtake the US and replace the US as the hegemonic power in the world presently. And yet we still know the United States is very mighty. It's the most powerful in the world, if not quite the largest, depends on how you measure it or market measures. It's still the largest economy in the world, although on other measures, it's smaller than China. It has the highest income per person of all the major economies, way, way, way higher than China. I just looked at the figures today, $80,000 per capita income in the US and only about 13,000 in China. It's a leader in many key high-tech sectors, and of course its finance sector is by far the most important and largest in the world. And not to be forgotten, perhaps increasingly most important, its military might is greater than all the other nations of the world put together. So that remains the strength of the US state and its economy and its power in finance and military, way, way higher and bigger and hegemonic across the world presently. Its policies, it thinks, should decide what happens in the world because of these powerful factors and foundations that it has in 21st century. But its position in the world, at least in certain sectors, has begun to decline relatively. These are the shares of world GDP in 1980. You can see that the US had about 27% of the world GDP in shares in 1980. China had less than 2%. Now, the US has dropped a bit to 24%, not a huge drop, but the big rise is China up to 16% of world GDP in 2019 before the pandemic. And if you want to compare that to another hugely populated country, just go down to India, which was in 1980 virtually the same as China in a share of world GDP. China's share of world GDP has gone up to 16%. India's just at 3%. So you can see the dramatic change that's taken place. China jumping from 12th place to 2nd place in the world. That is the fear that the US has about the developments. And the US has lost its trading position in the world gradually over decades. If you go back to the 1960s, in the period of so-called golden age, the US was still running a trade surplus with the rest of the world. It was selling more goods and services to the rest of the world than it was importing. But gradually that position has changed and accelerated in many ways during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, so that it was running a significant deficit with the rest of the world, who were exporting more goods to it than it was exporting to them, by up to nearly 5 or 6% of US GDP. That's declined a little bit. The reason for that is, perhaps if I can explain later, is still, nevertheless, a large deficit on trade that the US now has. So it's got to finance that deficit. It's buying more goods from abroad than it's selling in exports, so it needs to finance that by raising funds to do so. Of course, it has the US dollar, the international method of exchange of all the currencies in the world. It dominates and is in a position to provide support for America's purchases around the world. But even there, the value of the dollar, its ability, its purchasing power against other currencies and for foreign imports and so on, has gradually declined over the last 50 years. If you take the index in 1973 at 100, you can see that it's gradually periods of going upwards above that figure and downwards in a cycle, but generally the trend is down to something like 15% of where it was in the 1970s. So the dollar's ability to buy goods for the US economy has declined gradually over that period. And then perhaps more startling is the rise of China in production, particularly as we've seen in terms of the share of total output in the world, but also in the terms of manufacturing in particular. So here is China back in the 1990s with only 5% of world manufacturing output. Now it's 35%, and you can see the shares that have disappeared for the G7 economies. Even the US, which was the biggest manufacturing economy back in the 1990s, even in the 1990s, has fallen way back from about 20% to under 15% now, while China has gone from 5 to 35. And if we take that in shares, we can see that now China has a bigger share than the next 10 countries in the manufacturing sector. That's the dramatic change that's taken place in the last 30 years. It is now the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, with, as I say, something like 35% of world manufacturing, while all the other G7 economies have gradually lost their share to China over that period. And it leads in exports, not just in general exports, but now increasingly in high-tech exports. In the latest figures that I have available in 2022, China had nearly 770 billions worth of high-tech exports, way more than any other country, including Germany and the United States. So not just it is now a manufacturing powerhouse, but it's not just selling consumer goods, textiles, cheap goods that we used to buy from China, but now increasingly high technological goods used in all sorts of components around the world, including, of course, motor cars, electric vehicles, etc. And it's on motor cars, we can see now it's now the top exporter in the world. It's overtaken every other major car exporting country in the world, including Germany, Mexico, Japan, Korea. And of course, the United States is well out of that range now. But China is now exporting nearly 6 million cars a year across the world. And also in this high-tech area, R&D spending, that's the key area for innovation and new technology being introduced. The US still dominates as the major R&D investing economy in the world, and it's been increasing that position in billions of dollars. But you can see the dramatic rise in China's position from nowhere back at the beginning of this century to second place and fast catching up with the United States. R&D spending as a percentage of GDP in Japan is just under 3.5%. The US continues to accelerate actually towards 3.5% too, and passing Japan. But China is again coming from nowhere very fast to close the gap with the United States and Japan. And automation in Chinese industry is dramatic. Robot density. This is last year's figures. You can see the Republic of Korea is the leading robot per 10,000 employees. 1,000 robots for every 10,000 employees is operating in Korea, followed by Singapore, but then China. China just under 500 robots per 10,000 employees. Well, are now above Germany, Japan, Sweden, and the others. The United States is well down on that list, half the number of robots per 10,000 compared to China. So again, in key areas of industry, automation, China is making dramatic progress. And even in semiconductor chips, this is the area where the US claims that it has the advantage. It's going to sustain that advantage. It's going to block the ability of China to develop the latest, most advanced semiconductor chips and things components that go into just about everything now. And on that basis, it's the key chips war, which has been launched particularly in the last 20 years. Here's the US share up the top here, still just around 40% is their growth rate of increase in production of semiconductor chips. But you can see very quickly that we're seeing a quick rise now in acceleration on the part of Chinese production in chips and semiconductors, even to the most advanced ones that US has already produced. So the famous Taiwan semiconductor industry is nothing compared to the way China is now developing, even in the semiconductor area. And a scientific explosion. China has now the top 1% of scientific papers in the last 3 years. China is the leader with just about 5,500 citations. The US down around about 4,000 and the rest nowhere. So China is now incorporating and developing a huge scientific base to its economy, which enables it to leap forward in all these important new areas. A skilled and educated workforce. China has the greatest number of STEM graduates in the world in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Over 3.5 million now, compared to India's 2.5 million, and the US is 820,000 STEM graduates in 2020. And again, everybody else really nowhere. So China is not only got the technological advances it's making, not only got the innovations, but it's also got the people, so highly educated that can develop in these particular areas. This success, in my view, has been driven by the fact that China is a state-led economy. It's driven by its state companies. It's been able to direct investment into the areas that matter, and it's not dependent upon the profitability to be found in markets, but it's dependent upon whether the state wants to direct its state companies in that direction, and also private companies in that direction. For companies now from the US and China account for nearly 50% of the top 500 companies in the world. And since 2000, the percentage of Chinese firms in the global 500 top list has increased from 2% to 27%, while American firms' share of the top 500 has declined by 1/3 to 25%. And the state sector is the key in these big companies. The majority of Chinese firms on that top list are state-owned enterprises. They account for 71% of the total Chinese firms on that list. 78% of total revenue comes from state companies, and 84% of all the assets come from these state sector companies in China. So this has contributed to the phenomenal rise that we've seen in the Chinese economy in the last 40 years, particularly in the last 2020. The most important industries are run by state-owned enterprises, finance, energy, infrastructure, mining, etc. And the total capital of these companies, with some level of state ownership, not necessarily majority, but some level, is now 2/3 of all the capital of firms in China. There's no comparison with any other country in the level of state ownership and control as exists in China. But nevertheless, despite that process, China is still way behind in big areas. The US maintains important areas of supremacy, particularly its financial position. Its share of global assets remains. The US dollar is still some 40% of all global assets in the world, everything quoted in dollars, compared to the euro, which is mainly within the Eurozone area, at around 30%. And China is nowhere in terms of when it comes to global assets. Nobody holds global assets in renminbi or yuan. They hold them either in euros or in dollars. And US has made an improvement in its trade deficit because it's now become a major crude oil producer. Fossil fuel development is now primarily taking place in the United States, a huge expansion from just about 11% of the world total of crude oil production. And through shale oil production and gas, it is now up to 16%, while Russia's and Saudi Arabia's share is not being improved at all, if not falling back. It's now the fossil fuel giant in the world. And also, the dollar and the euro remain dominant in international payments. The US dollar still has 45% of international payments taking place each year. The euro nearly the same. And if you want to find the yuan or the Chinese renminbi, you won't even find it on the list of the top 10 currencies being used in international payments. But above all, the US has military might. It has the strongest military presence domestically and overseas, with 1.3 million soldiers stationed at home and abroad, with nearly 5,000 military sites worldwide. The number of military sites is equivalent to the whole state of Virginia in size. It trains its troops all over the place. It has deployments of something like 230,000 military personnel at any one day in foreign countries, of which 168,000 active duty troops ready to go to war. So it's in a powerful military might across the world, with something like, I believe, we estimate something like 700 military bases across the world that the US has. And it's in various countries: Japan, Germany, South Korea. All the major countries have positions where the US troops are presently based. On the other hand, China has one military base in Djibouti, alongside the Americans, the French, and the Japanese. And that's the only military base it has overseas compared to the US. However, the situation is now becoming very intense in the conflict between China and the US. I think that starts in particular for when we had the Great Recession of 2008-9, when the major world economies collapsed, with the exception of China, which managed to go forward. Trade fell back. You can see on this graph that total trade, while it was expanding as a percentage of GDP up until the Great Recession, has stagnated since the global financial crash, whether it's in goods or in total trade, including services. And that means there's a real squeeze on the ability of the major economies in the world to expand their economies by exporting and by investing abroad. And because of that squeeze, it increases the intensity of the problem for the US and its allies as in dealing with the rise of China. Now, a lot of people say that we're entering a multipolar world where the US is no longer hegemonic, that there is a new poles of resistance to US imperialism, but in particular in the so-called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and that this new force could well replace or at least compete properly with US imperialism over the next period. And you can see, if you look at share of GDP, then the BRICS total is now higher than the G7 total as a share of GDP. But within the BRICS, the vast majority of that share is coming from China, we've seen, from 70% of global GDP. India has only got 7 or even less, and the other countries are tiny. So this is no equally shared BRICS. It's not a group which is with equal economic power. Really, only China threatens the US in that area. And if you look at the position of the change that has taken place between the G7 or first world countries in their share of GDP, 62% in 1974, now 44%. But you can see the Soviet Union or ex-Soviet Union countries really have lost their share altogether. India has gone up a little bit. The third world, the so-called third world or global south, pretty much unchanged. The big change is the share in the global GDP in PPP terms that China has had, and the relative decline in the G7. So it's China that's growing. It's China that's threatening US hegemony and imperialism, not BRICS as such. And in fact, the BRICS don't really have any possibility of playing a role, in my view, of opposition to the US and its other allies in the G7. This figure just demonstrates it. Although other countries are apparently going to join the BRICS, maybe Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., it really will remain a very small economic force if you consider it as per capita GDP. You can see that the BRICS is way, way behind, including China, compared to the per capita GDP that's held by the US and its allies, as I mentioned before. So, and moreover, the BRICS are very diverse in population. China and India are huge. South Africa and others are tiny. GDP per head, we've just seen, is widely distributed too. And they're far apart geographically and in trade composition. And of course, the ruling elites in these countries are often at loggerheads with each other. In past, China v. India, Brazil v. Russia. And can we really expect the BRICS to be an anti-imperialist force when when Modi rules in India, when Putin rules in Russia, where Lula is in Brazil, with Xi in China, South Africa under Ramaphosa, and these other countries that might be joining? Are they really anti-imperialist forces, progressive, that could bring about the end of US imperialism? Or are they just looking for their own nationalist interests rather than changing the structure of the world economy as we see it now? The US now has so far moved from engagement with China, as it did from the 1970s to the end of the 20th century. It's moved away from the period of engagement, but it realized it was not having any effect on controlling what was going on in China, to a policy of containment, which is adopted up to now. And that containment means to drive China back, to strangle its ability to grow and to reverse its progress. It started in this Cold War now with economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are not new. They've been used by imperialists in the past against peoples who lived outside the so-called civilized world. And now we see the process of the US doing the same with oil embargoes and various other measures that have been used in the past. And now we see it moving towards the dealing with trade tariffs, with blockages on chips, and on sanctions against various individuals and companies, blocking their ability to sell their goods or invest abroad. So we've got, starting with Trump, we've had agencies banning Huawei and barring Chinese officials, and we've had Chinese investors being blocked from purchasing and developing Chinese companies, and sanctions against several businesses in China for helping Russian military, and now limits on sales of semiconductors to China under the Biden administration. And we know that when Trump comes to office on the 25th of January, one of the first things he plans to do is to proceed to hike tariffs across the board from the world, but in particular, he's talking about a 60% hike to Chinese imports in order to force Chinese exports out of the country and to try to encourage American industry to come home and to build and export at home. So a big attempt to destroy Chinese export and manufacturing prowess in the period under the Trump administration. But also perhaps most worryingly, the development of military activity against China. They're already surrounding China with bases and missiles and allies. But there's even talk of making NATO, which originally was a so-called defense organization for Europe, and spreading it globally to have a NATO Asia and dramatically increase the spending in order to do so. Here's a figure, very latest figure from the NATO's own report, which shows a huge increase in defense expenditure by the existing members of NATO, dramatically up in the last 10 years from where it was before. It was more or less flat, but the last 10 years we've seen a dramatic rise, all part of the process to develop forces not only to deal with Russia in Europe, but also, in my view, to develop the forces necessary to deal with China in Asia. And today, it was announced that NATO leaders are looking to raise the percentage of GDP spent on defense by each country as members of NATO from 2% to 3% of GDP. That's a 50% increase in defense spending in terms of GDP, which can only come out of public services and other civil expenditure made by governments. Let me finish on say this. We're now moving to the real danger, I think, of armed conflict in Asia. Engels forecast in 1887 that leading industrial powers that have reached a point where the drive for supremacy could lead to a world war, moreover, of an extent and violence hitherto unimagined. 8 to 10 million soldiers at each other's throats, he said, which will strip Europe barer than a swarm of locusts. And of course, that did come about in 1914. How it will all end, he said, and who will emerge as a victor from this battle, he did not say and could not say in 1887. I don't think we can say either, but all we can say is that we seem to be moving not just to a conflict based on sanctions, on trade, on the blocking of investment, but also to the real danger of military conflict between US as the hegemonic power and China as the rising power. Even the liberal elements in the capitalist economy and strategists are saying something similar. A new world is being born. The hope for peaceful relations is fading, says Martin Wolf in the FT. No one knows what will happen, but we do know this looks to be a disaster. In the long term, the emergence of two blocs with deep splits between them is likely, as is the accelerating reversal of globalization and the sacrifice of business interests, which are of interest to him, to geopolitics. Even nuclear war is, alas, conceivable. And there is the risk that we face now in this part of the imperialist project to remove China from a position of strength and to stop its growth.
Thank you so much, Michael. As always, very thought-provoking and with lots of graphics to support your point. So thank you very much. Comrades, if you would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please click raise hand. Can I ask you a couple of questions then before I bring comrades in? So, I mean, you have described China is on the rise, US is in decline. Nothing lasts forever, of course. How does this kind of change, though, happen? And is China in the position, as mixed economy, if we put it politely, where the state sector is so important, it's not a proper capitalist country. Could it become the new world hegemon of imperialism with its strange, leftover semi-Stalinized version, no free trade unions, etc.? It's not really imperialist yet either. Could you see that change happening? And is such change always linked to war, or could we see, a new imperialist power rising without war?
Well, I suppose that the answer to that question is what you think the nature of the Chinese state and the economy is. In my view, that this is a big debate amongst socialists and everybody, that you hear, let's take the mainstream or the Western view of in the papers is divided. Half of them say that China is just another capitalist economy with its interests. And for some reason, capitalism is doing fantastically well in China and nowhere else. which they find difficult to explain. Then on the other hand, no, it's not. It's some Stalinist totalitarian dictatorship where the state rules and free markets and democracy is not allowed. So apparently it's one or the other as far as the West is concerned. I think that also reflects in some ways the view even among the left and socialists. There's quite a number of socialists who would say that China is capitalist, not only capitalist, it's imperialist, it's exactly the same as the US or the other G7 economies, and it tries to control other countries, it tries to exploit other countries' labor, and so on. Well, I don't find that very convincing as an argument. I've looked at the data very closely. The US and the G7 economies invest huge amounts of foreign capital and have done over the last century or more into the so-called global South, extracting huge amounts of value and profits from those countries, adding to their own profits at home through their multinationals and through trade. But if we look at the figures for China, there is no such, that's not happening. There is no huge amount of money coming into Chinese companies from the poor countries of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Not at all. China remains a very, very low level net gainer from its investments and trade from abroad. And in far as we're concerned, in trade with the US and G7, it loses out. Although it has a big surplus, it actually doesn't gain any profits out of that at all. It loses profits through its trade with the G7. So in my opinion, it can't be considered imperialist in the sense that I would mean. Also, looking at military bases, I mean, it's got one base, one temporary base. The US has 700 plus. Other G7 countries have them. Britain has loads of them. They have an imperialist past. How can that be considered the same in the case of China? India's got more bases than China. So it doesn't seem to me that that's a very convincing argument. It's certainly not financially superior either. It can't dictate internationally with its currency and so on. Is it capitalist? Well, that's another big issue. In my view, I don't consider it capitalist. I'll briefly say why. That in 1949, there was a revolution. The capitalists and landlords were thrown out, defeated in China by the communist guerrilla army, peasant army, which came into the cities. Chiang Kai-shek and the Comprador army that was backed by landlords and the capitalists fled to Taiwan, where his remnants remain, blocked away. China nationalized their economy, introduced a planning system Soviet style. They changed that halfway through in the late 1970s to opening up a capitalist sector, a market sector, allowing foreign investment. But as I showed, the state sector still dominates in the economy and really drives investment. China hasn't had a slump. Since 1950, all the capitalist economies have had slumps. In 1974, 1982, 1990, 2001, huge one in 2008, and then the pandemic slump in 2020. In none of those great slumps across the world did China's production go down. So that demonstrates to me that it's not operating the same way as a capitalist economy does, that when profitability collapses, the economy collapses. Because China has a state-directed economy, it doesn't allow profitability to decide where it invests and what happens. And even the capitalist sector and the big billionaire capitalists, which exist in China, if they don't play ball, they find themselves disappearing. And that is the attitude. Now, that doesn't mean to say that China is any democratic state. It's certainly not a democratic state. Workers don't have their own organizations which they can independently express their views over what happens in China. It's decided by the Politburo, by the Communist Party leaders and the 100 million Communist Party members all the way down this great bureaucracy. So it's certainly not a socialist society or a democratic socialist society. But on the other hand, in my view, it's not one that operates on the capitalist basis. And that's partly the reason for its success. I'll finish on this, Tina. A planned economy with state-led investment has shown how it can develop an economy from nothing. Compare it to India. India hasn't gone down that road. It's very much a capitalist economy with markets. Where is India in the world? Nowhere. Nowhere. It's not even competing in any particular area at all. And it cannot compete, and its poverty remains dramatic. While China has got rid of poverty, at least at World Bank levels, for 900 million Chinese in the last 40 years. So there's something significantly different about the nature of China.
Not socialist, though. That's for sure, isn't it? It would be. It would be. But it perhaps it can give us a little bit of hope.
Is it black and white? You see,
yeah,
exactly. It's not socialist. It's not capitalist. Oh, I get this question. If it's not socialist, it must be capitalist. If it's not capitalist, it must be socialist. No. Read your Marx, read Critique of the Gotha program, and you'll see there's a process of transition takes place.
Yeah.
China is in transition. But is it going directly to socialism or is it stuck? That's a matter of discussion.
Do you think it could take on the US? You know, is there a frontation coming as well? And will it be in a war?
I don't think it. Well, it's not. If it's going to take on by, you mean, can it defeat the US militarily and financially? No, I don't think it can. Can it defend its own national interests and its economy and its the lives of Chinese people and maintain their standards of living? I think it can. But it's not going to be easy if China faces an all-out attack financially, militarily, and trade-wise by the US. But I mean, a military conflict between China and the US is just frightening for the world. This is a disaster. Who knows where that might lead to? And hopefully that's not going to happen. But if it remains at the level of a Cold War, then I think China can survive, but it's not going to defeat the United States.
Take over the world. Yeah, no, I can't see that either. Thanks very much, Michael. I'm going to ask Anne first. Hi. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much, Michael. That was very interesting. By the way, I read your blog on Ireland and the potential end of the Irish form of economy recently, and included some of your information in an article I wrote on the Irish elections, and it was very useful. So what I wanted to ask you, there are two things. Firstly, what do you think the impact of Trump's policy of bringing the corporations home, how do you think that will interact with the overall aspiration to keep China down? Because obviously if they return home, that opens up new opportunities for Chinese investment, I would have thought. And then the second thing is, I suppose this is quite a big question, really. It was interesting what you're saying about a bureaucracy, a bureaucratic plan being able to solve the problems that emerge with capitalism and the kind of the traditional forms, classic form of capitalism. The problems that emerge are being resolved by the Chinese bureaucracy. When you compare that to the situation in the Soviet Union and how, it as a bureaucratic plan created enormous waste. I mean, I'm not saying that there's a straightforward answer, but it is interesting. I mean, like, you're absolutely right. These kind of hybrid economies were predicted as being something that would happen. I suppose I think are happening because of the failure of the working class to defeat capitalism. We're in this kind of situation, a kind of a stuck situation, but the kind of stucknesses are interesting in and of themselves, because yes, it seems to be a very efficient economy, whereas you wouldn't expect the bureaucracy to be so efficient. I mean, even looking at how government, in Ireland or in Britain, elsewhere, operates, they're often very slow to be able to deal with things. Things stay the same for a very long time. Anyway, that's just my 2 points, Michael. Thank you very much.
Michael, I'm going to take a couple more if that's okay. Or would you rather, because we've got quite a few people with their hand up. Ian, please.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk, and also I thoroughly enjoyed both your blog and your articles in Weekly Worker. There's a few things that went through my mind as you were speaking. Firstly, not only is there a vast amount of stuff being produced in China, but the quality of it is increasingly good. This was something you didn't see in the Soviet Union, where the quality of Soviet products was universally awful. If you just take Chinese motorbikes, for example, in the 50s and 60s, they were producing those dreadful Ural things in their own version, which was basically a 1940s BMW that had been ripped off. And now they're producing sort of world-class things that are challenging the Japanese motorbikes. And the same goes with cars and all sorts of other stuff. And that's one of the reasons why it was impossible in the Soviet Union to enforce quality was because it was almost impossible to exert any real discipline over the workforce, except with the threat of violence, as it were. And you can't really make good stuff with just threatening people with violence or whatever. And so Soviet workers worked badly, always, as their only form of resistance. But Chinese workers don't seem to have that position. So presumably there's some form of class struggle going on where there is the ability to exert discipline over the workforce. Presumably if you lose your job in a factory that makes iPhones or something, then you've lost a really good job and you end up doing something awful. So there must be some sort of class struggle going on. I'm more interested in the whole question around tariffs. Tariffs against Chinese goods would mean a huge cut to the wages, effectively, of the US working class, surely. And the idea that somehow US industry could upscale very, very quickly to make up for all the fabulous stuff that comes out of China, it seems to me quite fanciful. And so, in other words, the tariffs are going to be themselves, I would have thought, something of a flashpoint for class struggle in the USA. The other thing is, militarily, how could one ever imagine China being occupied? I mean, it has a huge land area. The Chinese Red Army, such as it is, may well be kind of pretty low tech, but it is enormous, and I'm sure it's capable of guerrilla warfare or whatever else. So I can't help but feel that if whilst they maintain a military threat, ultimately the aim will be to strangle China economically rather than militarily, because militarily it seems to be just logistically impossible. The other thing is, what we saw with the Soviet oligarchy, the people who managed to get their hands on state industries and asset strip it, and then eventually rescue maybe some bits of it, or managed to get their hands on extractive industries and make vast sums of money. The first thing they did was export their money into real money, as it turned in, invest in Cyprus or Switzerland, and salt their money away so that if they needed to escape, they could. Does that not happen in China? I mean, there are presumably Chinese oligarchs who managed to salt their money away somewhere. Or are there controls on that happening? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you get back to this now, Michael. There's quite a lot of questions there,
Yes. Of course.
but related, those two speakers. So yeah, thank you.
Well, of course, to answer all this question properly would be another session, but we haven't got time for that, and other people want to speak. Just say that I think Anne's right. If Trump thinks that by applying all these tariffs, and American industry is going to take over, and the gap that will appear for Chinese goods, at least in price, and American industry will come home sufficiently to replace this and make America great again. This is a complete illusion that is not going to happen. It's impossible to achieve that any longer. All it's going to do is, it's been pointed out, it's going to drive up inflation probably, unless the economy is collapsing. But if it's going still forward, it's going to drive up the inflation prices for all sorts of goods that the Chinese imports currently provide in the American economy. So it's going to hit living standards unless the economy is dramatically rising thanks to Trump's new Make America Great Again investments that are taking place. This is an illusion that's going to happen, that it's not going to happen, and therefore it's merely just going to complicate the situation even further when it comes to the question of trade between the US and China and globally, because Trump is saying that if the rest of the world doesn't do the same thing and start boycotting and making it more difficult for China to export, then they'll suffer the tariff increases as well. There's going to be a whole basis on which global trade will implode. The estimate it could cut world GDP by up to 6% from where it would otherwise would be over a period of Trump's administration, if this is applied across the board. Although, of course, I think it's partly a bargaining weapon. Trump sees himself as a businessman. So I'm going to stick up these tariffs unless you do X, Y, and Z, and then I won't do it for our benefit. So it's going to be all that sort of palaver is going to go on for some time. So I think Anne's right that China will be able to take advantage in many ways of replacing American industry if it's not prepared to play the role that it currently does in various parts of the world and goes home insofar as that happens. Let's just say something about China again then. In my view, it is a planned economy where the state controls, but the working class do not control that society. There's no independent working class organizations that can do so. There's no democracy in any sense that we could understand, apart from the fact that the Communist Party decide somewhat democratically with themselves with factions about who should lead the country every so often, or maybe not even do that. But they operate through that system, and it's a bureaucratic system. So that means a lot of the decisions about what happens in the economy are made at the top. Of course, they are in capitalist economies as well, so that doesn't necessarily improve things. But when every big decision depends on the bureaucracy at the top, then big mistakes can be made. And a lot of them have been. There have been huge zigzags in the economy, which have damaged the ability of China to go forward. I'm thinking particularly real estate, which is a subject on its own that we could discuss. But what that means is, unless you have democratic control and democratic accountability to working people through organizations independently that they control, then inevitably you're going to have those problems. And one of the big things about the Chinese state, we talk about Chinese leaders and all the effort not being imperialist, but they're not internationalist. They're not appealing to the working class of the capitalist world to overthrow their governments and establish socialism. Quite the reverse. They wish to preserve the status quo. They don't want any trouble. They don't want the working class to overthrow the United States administration. They really don't. Or the British, they want everything to be nice and steady so they can just go on developing their economy and maintaining their position. What we have now is US imperialism preparing to try, as Ian said, to destroy that stability, destroy the economy. And why has Syria collapsed? Because its economy collapsed. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? Because its economy collapsed. That's the aim of US imperialism over the next 10 years, to destroy the Chinese economy. I don't think they can succeed, but they're going to make big efforts to do so. And that's the purpose behind them. Billionaires in China, well, as I say, there are billionaires and they operate and often in close connections with the Chinese bureaucracy leadership. But on the other hand, if they don't toe the line, they soon find themselves in great difficulty. That doesn't happen in the US. It's the other way around. Billionaires control the state. Trump's cabinet is completely composed of billionaires, or we used to call them in Russia oligarchs. I think we should call them hedge fund oligarchs and private equity oligarchs, which is what we have in the US cabinet now. That's the situation. China doesn't have a cabinet of billionaires. It has billionaires, but it doesn't have a cabinet of billionaires, and billionaires must toe the line.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, we've got quite a few people, so if you could keep it short, comrades, that'd be useful. Alan, please. He doesn't have a camera, but we'll be able to hear him.
Yeah, that's a pretty good overview, I think, of the situation. I would agree with Michael about the nature of the Chinese state and its wider economy. We can all have our terms we want to just use to describe it, but it's not just an economic question, I don't think. I think it's also a political question. Because although, as I think has been said, a military invasion and subjugation of China by US imperialism, world imperialism, is probably inconceivable. If they were to be successful in somehow damaging the Chinese economy, or the bureaucrats make a major strategic mistake which allows that to develop, what we could see is the capitalist class which exists in China wanting to take advantage of this situation and propel them into some kind of leadership. And the aim of imperialism against Russia is to dismember it into smaller parts, and I would imagine that that would be part of their strategic approach to China, that you'd want to break it up, make blocks with the strongest capitalists in different areas, and come to some arrangement where they can be the small comprador bourgeoisie in those areas. So I don't think that military conflict between the West and China is inconceivable. And so the question is, whatever you want to call it, this transitional state stuck in a post-capitalist, pre-socialist situation, what would be the approach of Marxists and communists towards such a military conflict between an openly capitalist force like US-led imperialism and this Chinese state of whatever you want to describe it, post-capitalist society? So that's a question, I think, for the audience. And I don't know if I've heard Michael speak, or I've read a bit of your stuff on China, and I don't know if you've dealt with that question. The other thing is about the BRICS, because quite clearly it's not anti-imperialist in the kind of conscious anti-imperialist sense of wanting to get rid of imperialism. Most of the states and powers inside the BRICS would like to be imperialist. They're capitalist states. But it is interesting because it is a non-imperialist bloc. It's a bloc which contains no imperialist states. Now, I know not everyone in the audience would agree with that, but I think that, as I understand it, that's your position, Michael.
Yeah.
And in terms of the defense of China against the plans of world imperialism to destroy it and break it up and remove it as a problem, to what extent even though the BRICS is not a direct competitor against world imperialism, does it provide a framework which can help protect China against the attempts to destroy the Chinese economy? Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Paul Smith, please.
Right, thank you, Michael, for the talk.
Michael.
I really enjoyed it, and I really liked what you were saying about China being neither capitalist or socialist. I thought that was nicely put. I mean, this part of my mind says, well, let's look at the arguments. I think you began to address those well. I'm more inclined to think of the China as being some kind of hybrid between Stalinism and capitalism in some way. I don't know if that fits into what you're saying. Maybe not. But my questions were actually preempted by Ian's questions about the effect of Trump's tariffs on the working class in the States, but also thinking about the working class in China as well, what kind of effect they might have in terms of the development of class consciousness. I mean, it seems to me that if the standard of living of workers goes down under Trump, that should have some kind of political consequences. I'm just wondering what you think of the potential in the coming period, especially as in the run-up to a war, which I see as being pretty well inevitable, given after Trump's exhausted the right-wing potential of attacking immigrants, where else is he going to go except to attack China? But that's a political matter, not an economic one. But anyway, those are my questions.
I'll bring Marian in as well, and then back to Michael. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we're starting to be a bit more dialectical in our understanding, because that's what's been missing in a lot of people. They see it has to be one thing or another. It is a transitional society still. It is post-capitalist. But as Trotskyists, we believe in permanent revolution and world revolution. And the only way that we're going to defeat imperialism and capitalism is by world revolution. The question is, how do we bring it about? Now, obviously, if we in the imperialist countries can build a mass anti-war movement and can build opposition to the capitalist system, then we're playing our role in what needs to be done. Because unless we do that, we are getting closer to war. Everything it shows that. So we have to be dialectical and look at processes and see that there are contradictions. That's what I've learned, that we have to look at how things are unfolding. What are the contradictory processes that are involved? And how do we, in this country, we have a role of changing people's consciousness and educating people to understand what processes are happening and why things are happening in the way that they're doing. And how we could have a big campaign opposing increasing defence spending. And start a big campaign to make sure that there's proper mental health services, that kids are not being murdered by their parents because of the lack of supervision, and having solutions for working people. This is part of it. It's not just what happens in Russia, China, or America. That's just one part of it. You've got to look at the whole world and the different types of society that there are. I.e., in the olden days, we would have talked about the three sectors of world revolution. So this is what we have to do. We have to look at the world as a whole, the system as a whole, how it's broken down, and how do we change it. Unless we do that, we're not going to achieve much. Our key task is building a big anti-war movement and to start advocating for working class democracy in this country. We haven't even got working class democracy in this country. We've got more anti-union laws in this country than most of Europe. So, it's not either or, they're different processes. So we need to be a bit sharper as well in our thinking. And remember, we need to be dialectical materialists, not just historical materialists, but dialectical materialists.
Thanks, Marian. Back to you, Michael.
Oh, right. Well, I think Alan's raised a very important point that the situation in China means that there is a large capitalist sector. That capitalist sector looks to make profits. It's not looking to achieve social needs or to even meet state targets unless the state tells it to do so. And that sector would be very keen, particularly the top echelons, particularly in the financial part of the Chinese capitalist sector, to have Chinese economy as a fully capitalist one. So that is the hope of the US imperialism, that they will, as you say, weaken the Chinese economy so much that the existing bureaucratic leadership or the leadership of the Communist Party, such as it is now, loses popular support. There is movement against the leadership. It starts to crack, and the capitalist wing can move in and provide a political alternative backed by US imperialism. And we have China as part of the great imperialist bloc after a long period of struggle within China. That is the aim in the case of US imperialism when it comes to Russia. They wish to bring down the Putin regime and replace it with a pro-Western regime. They will call that democratic, but of course that's just a loose phrase, a fig leaf over what's intended. It's that they should act in the interests of US imperialism. And so there is that pro-capitalist wing. It's not an insignificant factor. And the position of the Communist Party bureaucracy in opposing that depends on their ability to sustain the economy. So far, they've been able to do that sufficiently. So although there is continual class struggle in China, as there is in every country, there are hundreds of protests and strikes over each month in China, in local areas and so on, usually against local officials, against local managers. They take action to remove them on the spot. Sometimes the police intervene, sometimes they don't. So that level, at a local level, there are continual actions within China against employers, particularly in the private sector, by the way, where pay is generally less than it is in the state sector, but also against officials in the government and so on. The Chinese leadership is not too worried about that as long as it doesn't threaten the Chinese state at the top. But that process is bubbling away all the time. Workers are exploited in China. Workers have to go to work and they have to produce value, both for the private sector and for the state companies. So when you have exploitation, you have class struggle. That doesn't disappear. We don't have a completely socialist system in China. You can't have it, in my view, in one country. You can't even have it in the United States unless we make it internationalist. And there I agree with Marion entirely. Unless we have an internationalist change where the major economies of the world come under the control of the working class and its organizations, and they can plan cooperatively, then the class struggle will continue in all these countries, particularly when they're based on this national level, even in countries that are being relatively successful in their economies, like China. And that means also that the BRICS, in my view, can't provide that anti-imperialist force in any significant way. They're merely coming together to defend themselves against US imperialism. Some people call it the axis of resistance. So it's not an internationalist approach on the part of the BRICS. It's a coming together to resist US imperialism, to try to find some ways to trade without having to use the dollar, and so on, finding various methods to sustain their economies without allowing US multinationals and US financial sector to take them over and dominate them. And so that's as far as it goes, really. China can go further because it has a different sort of economic system which enables it to do that. And so that's why I see the significant difference in China. That's why the US hates it more. I see on the chat line a few people have mentioned, well, China does buy foreign companies and tries to get resources out of places in Africa and so on, setting up companies, investing and so on. Yes, it does. It's very interested in getting resources to sustain its own economy. But the state companies and state banks that intervene in that on behalf of China to buy these investments are not looking to make huge profits like the multinational companies backed by the IMF do in Africa and Asia and Latin America. They're looking to get resources that the Chinese economy can develop at the home. If you want to call that imperialism, well, it's very limited, because all I can say across the board, it's peanuts compared to what the G7 economies and multinationals and the banks behind them operate across the world, and what they extract from the world, and what they've extracted from the rest of the world for the last 150 years, not just for the last 40.
Thank you. Alan asked you a question, which I thought was kind of interesting. If China and the US actually do go to war, do you think we should take a position supporting either?
Yes, I think we should. I mean, just think about this, comrades. If say US imperialism wins in such a war, or replaces the existing regime in China with a pro-capitalist, pro-multinational, pro-international banking state government that runs the country and privatizes the whole economy to make it a free market, to use Milei of Argentina's phrase for everything. If that's what the US plans to do, which it does, and they win, that would be a huge defeat, I think, for the development of how we can see society developing the interests of the global South in particular and the people of the world. To maintain the Chinese state, even as it is, would be better than allowing US imperialism to take over. So, yes, I would defend China. That doesn't mean to say we don't have criticisms of the way Chinese state and the leadership operates in many areas. In many ways, I have big criticisms about the fact that they allow such a large capitalist sector to operate, and that a lot of them take nice big corrupt money out of it accordingly. That's not how a socialist government should operate. But is it not the case that it would be better if China survived in a battle, whether it's economic or military, against US, because what the US would replace it with would be something way, way worse.
I mean, realistically, it'll be over Taiwan, first of all, isn't it? And that's, of course, a tricky question.
Hotspot. They're going to say, look, China's going to invade Taiwan next week, next month. I keep reading US military said it's going to happen last week or next year or whenever. It's all going to happen. The Chinese aren't desperate to invade Taiwan. Let's remember that Taiwan is officially part of China. It's not a separate state. That's not because the Chinese say it is, apart from the fact that it's like being just the Isle of Wight next to the rest of Britain. But it is always being considered part of China. Even the Chinese government in Taiwan, the Taiwanese government recognizes that they're part of China. It's just that they want to have a capitalist China, not a socialist one. And that on top of that, it's recognized by the UN and the United States. But nevertheless, apparently, China cannot operate in the mainland China, cannot operate and comment on what happens in China or support people who want to bring about complete integration, because that is interfering in Chinese democratic affairs. So what we do is we put a load of missiles on Taiwan and we build up the Taiwanese army. Of course, the Taiwanese army couldn't possibly defend a Chinese invasion, but we look to perhaps provoke China into doing something which will enable the US to organize a much more intense campaign. Just imagine, it's a bit similar to Ukraine, that Ukraine provokes all kinds of situations against a minority within the Ukraine territory of Ukraine. Russia invades, and suddenly the whole world is out to take Russia down. That's exactly what the US hopes to achieve in the case of Taiwan.
You're right. It's a very similar situation, actually, indeed. But it will stumble up a lot of lefties, presumably, because in theory, the Taiwanese people have the right to determine their own.
It's
destiny.
like saying the Isle of Wight has the right to determine its own independence from Britain, if that's what it wants. Well, that's a sort of, particularly in the case of the Isle of Wight example, the Isle of Wight is inhabited in the case of Taiwan by all the old comprador bourgeois nationalist capitalists from the Civil War and their descendants, and these are the people that are operating in Taiwan and have done so for the last 70 years.
Well, it'll be a subject that'll come back, no doubt, very, very soon. Agnes, please.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Oh, wonderful. So amazing presentation, so clear, and can't thank you enough, Michael. So I have two very short and very ignorant questions. The first one is that from what you said, I kind of understood that for the time being, the United States is the one which is the most powerful in the world. So why are they keep being annoyed by China? Why are they, making up all this? So anyway, I don't have to extend on that because they do it, and then of course the United Kingdom joins in. So I don't understand what's the point. The other thing is that have I misread or misheard that you had a quote from Engels, who said that the next war is going to be absolutely terrible? And is that what I saw and heard? Is that what you did? The reason why I'm asking, because just half a minute more, Tina, because Bernard Shaw, the writer, considers Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle as the presentation of capitalism as Engels sees it. And at the end of the Ring Cycle, Brunhilde makes a fire and the whole world burns down and collapses. So should we not be scared that we reach that point? I mean, you quoted Engels, so should we be scared now that we reach the point that the whole world might be just defeated? And not defeated, just ruined. And so these are the two ignorant questions.
Thank you. Not ignorant at all. Thanks, Agnes. Ryan, if the climate catastrophe doesn't do it, is nuclear war going to get us? Hi, Brian.
This is one of the issues where I disagree with Michael on the issue of China. Look, has anybody heard of the COMAC C919 plane, right? China intends to produce 100 of those a month. That's 2/3 of the production rate of Airbus and Boeing together. It will break Boeing. Boeing's on the verge of bankruptcy. But the C919 really highlights the problem. People ask the question, why is it that Germany has followed and engaged in such self-harm with the United States? The reason is Germany's petrified of China. It's not petrified of the United States. It is really scared that its economy is going to be hammered into the ground by China, which is already happening. Why does Trump talk about 50% tariffs? Because the US economy is 50% uncompetitive. If you take TSMC's new fab, that's the place where they produce chips in Arizona, the cost of producing a chip there is 50% more than in Taiwan. I don't think you have to worry about Taiwan. Taiwan's not the trigger for war. What the trigger for war is whether or not the United States can hold back China's technical development. That is the trigger for war, and it's not being able to hold it back. If China sends up the value chain and robs the United States of its monopoly of the commanding heights of the value chain, everything goes, including the dollar, because it's the commanding heights of the value chain, not Wall Street, that props up the dollar. It's the super profits that the high-tech companies make that flow back into the United States that props up the dollar. Without it, the United States is a failed state. The other thing I want to quickly talk about is, now I don't want to monopolize, there's a lot more I can say, but all I can say is yes.
Have another couple of minutes, go on. Okay,
so you'll have seen on the chat that we are really, really focusing on Lakenheath Air Base. We are desperately worried about a nuclear war. And the United States Air Force is about to base nuclear weapons at Lakenheath once again. That's where a lot of the original cruise missile, nuclear-tipped cruise missiles were based. So that is one area that I think you in London should need to be focused on and come and join us. And there's going to be an invasion of Lakenheath sooner or later, Greenham Commons style. So the world is in a very precarious position. My own feeling is that the United States has failed to hold back China. It has failed to do what it did to Japan. Everybody looks at Japan and thinks it was the bust in the real estate that caused the lost generation in Japan. No, it wasn't. It was the United States smashing the yen in 1985 in the Paris Accords, and in 1988, embargoing, doing exactly what they're trying to do to China, they did to Japan very, very successfully. Effectively, the United States market for electronics was taken away from China, and without the economies of scale, the profits that the Japanese electronic companies could make was insufficient to really keep up with what was going on in the United States. I think they failed. I think they have failed to do that to China. And I think Huawei is an example of that. There's only one little weakness left. Well, it's a big weakness left in China, and that is its failure yet to develop an EUV lithography machine. Once it's done that, it's game over. It's world war. And on that lovely note, I'll finish.
Thanks, Brian. Anthony. You're muted, comrade.
Yeah, I got it now. Can you hear me? But stressful with that. I think there has to be a debate on Stalinism. That's basically one of the contradictory things. because the socialist revolutions occurred in the third of the world because capitalism could not develop the productive forces. But the reason you had Stalins and they were in backward countries. But it's only capitalism where money's dominated. But in the worker states, even under Stalinism, money's playing more of a role because of the world economy. So these sanctions actually have to. But I think the problem is there's a lot of impressionism about. We need to have discussions on Stalinism on the foreign policy. Because these debates are nothing new on the BRICS. What was the big dispute on the Chinese Revolution in 1925? Stalin wanted to put him out, liquidating into the Kuomintang. Trotsky said you should fight imperialism in the United Front with the bourgeoisie, but keep your class and political. And that's what the Chinese bureaucracy and Russian bureaucracy are doing, are using the trolls of the semi-colonial mass and the national bourgeoisie, because imperialism wants to get the whole third world or global south recolonized and mass privatization. So, you've seen this again. What's actually happened now? They've actually had that. They've lost that. You've seen the Syria revolution confirmed. Imperialism's got rid of Assad. The capitalism. They've done a deal with the fundamentalist elements of the Chinese and Russian bureaucracy and sacrificed them. And now imperialism can lose out there. The only thing I can rewind despite for campism is imperialism's losing out because they want everything privatized and the total world dominance. And the bureaucracies it can only keep its role for a nationalized economy. But the problem is, as Michael said, it's a bureaucratic control. But the problem with Michael is you're a bit eclectic. Some aspects you talk about the planned economy, and you should make the central thing, like Trotsky said, what a planned economy can do. Not in the abstract words of capital, but in the actual, in the railways, in the bridges, and this is central planning. The difference was what I think Ian said here was about the technique, and it wasn't Trotsky argued against that. It wasn't just because the workers were oppressed that they couldn't produce the goods. It's because they got education, free healthcare. They had to give because I think the working class are the ruling class because they've expropriated capitalism. You cannot have a separate state between capitalism and you can't have a state that's neither capitalism nor workers' state. And that's why we have to talk about degenerate workers' states. And that's why we've got to talk about there's elements of bureaucratic collectivism, which elements of that in your approach to that. Michael, some of your looks like, but when you're talking about exploitation, what it is bureaucratic pillage, and that debate and the American Socialist Workers' Internal Bulletins on that debate with Chapman. And what he said, we defend what's in the interest of the working class, nationalization, fight against colonialism. But what we don't do is when they do deals with imperialism, or they suppress workers' revolts, or they suppress, for example, when they support the American imperialism, Taliban, Trotsky, that's the greatest service to the workers' state. Because if you're strengthening imperialism in the semi-colonies, they're going to come after you to overthrow you in the planned economy. A lot of these arguments are new and in defense of Marxism. The big danger is even nobody's talking, as Marion said, about fighting against the imperialist war drive, because the dominant pressure in this country is imperialism. At least CND's moving now. But the next big danger is adapting to Stalin, and we should not be impressionistic. Stalin does not want the end of world capitalism, because world capitalism they'll be out next. But we're not capitalist. Stalinism can go first. We'll overthrow them first. But look, as Mary said, let's see what that's where Mandel's triangular struggle goes. I'll talk about that another time.
Thanks, Anthony. Michael, would you reply to the last three speakers?
Just on Agnes's points, well, I think other people have answered her first question. Why is the US, if the US is so powerful and the G7 is so powerful and headed, why are they bothering to take on China or try to reduce it? I think the answer to that is it's been explained by a lot of other people. And I think the main point I was making in the presentation was that China has made such a dramatic progress over the last 40 years that although it's still a long way behind the US as a financial and military power, it's increasingly becoming a rival economically and trade and manufacturing and in technology. And this is what frightens the US. And it's a massive, massive country, the largest populated country in the world, which is moving in a huge way forward. And it doesn't go along what the US wants to do. It's not, as Brian said, it's not a Japan. It's not in India. It's not a Brazil. It's not playing ball with the interests of US imperialism. They hoped it would. That's why they invested in it. They When Deng opened up the economy in the late 70s, they invested there. US manufacturers went there. They looked for the free market, a part of the economy, to provide an opportunity for capitalism to develop in the interests of America. But that did not happen. And as a result, they've now had to go away from a policy of engagement, was the phrase used, to a policy of containment. And I think, as somebody's suggesting now, to a policy of destruction. The aim is to reduce and reverse the gains that China has made over the recent period. And that's now the policy. So the danger is that in order to achieve that, they might even resort to military activity and conflict. And so my quote from Engels was to remind us what Engels, looking ahead, when he saw the rival imperialist powers developing, when UK was declining relatively to Germany, to the US and France and so on, that there's a real danger that we would see an imperialist war between the major imperialist powers trying to divide up the colonies and, above all, to control Europe, which is what we had in 1914. So he forecast that horrible danger. I put it in because it's a horrible danger that we have before us over the next period, however long we get to that point. Hopefully we'll never get to that point, but it is definitely a risk that we have before us. So I think that's basically what this presentation has been about, that Agnes has presented us with the general trends that we have before us and why this is taking place. I notice on the chat, people are saying, well, does Syria change the picture? Well, I don't think Syria is going to affect China too much. Will it block their Belt and Road? No, as I think Brian replied on the chat, he said, if Iran falls, that will be a different matter. And of course, as we now know, the US imperialism's aim was to wipe out all the countries in the Arab Spring of 2010, which formed secular governments for a brief period of time, and replace them with governments in the interest of imperialism. They've wiped them all out, one after the other, with the help and encouragement and support of Israel. They've managed to take out Syria now. There's only one left in the Middle East, and that's Iran. Bit of a handful, rather a large population, rather well organized, had a revolution, which, whatever you might think about it, has a certain level of support, even though the mullahs are probably hated in Iran. But this is not going to be such an easy nut to crack. But that's the next danger that we face. Russia is the country that is lost from the loss of Syria, not China, in my view.
Thanks, Michael. A last question, then, perhaps as a summing up. What can we learn, perhaps, from the success of the Chinese economy, which is not based on the profit margin or profit symptom, as you described, but not celebrate in a way that, you see, for example, George Galloway doing when he looked at the BRICS summit and he thinks it's wonderful, it's future, it's the axis of resistance. Not only is it the axis of resistance, he sees it as that's what we have to, strive towards, and that's going to be the alternative to US imperialism. And it's brilliant for us. And as you described, I mean, Putin, you got the Shah, the Iranian regime, theocratic regime. Dear God, these are, we're supposed to ally ourselves with these people. No, thank you very much. So not celebrate like that, but is there something that socialists can learn from the way that the Chinese economy runs, or is a lot of it based on the total oppression of the working class? Is that part of the success, and you couldn't actually replicate it if you were basing yourself on the democracy and the rule of the working class?
Well, of course, China was a peasant economy with nothing. It was poor in the late 1940s. It was a disaster. Capitalism had ruined when it developed from the early 1900s in China, from basically a semi-feudal society into a capitalist one. It was a nightmare of 40 years of warlords destroying the countryside, just fighting each other. Then they had the Japanese occupation, which annihilated millions of Chinese. This is a horrendous situation, worse than the period before Russia in 1917. So the revolution was a transformation that laid the basis for a better China. There's no doubt about it. And the basis of that was fundamentally a planned economy in the major sectors of the economy, and one where the state drove investment, and the profitability for capitalist companies was not decisive. The capitalist sector in China is significant, but not as significant enough to actually drive the investment and the consumption and the employment of the Chinese economy. It does not do so. It plays a secondary role, and it certainly doesn't control the state machine. It has to obey towards the state machine. It's clear the difference between the cabinet of Trump and the Politburo of Xi, and what the interests are in those two different leaderships that exist. One is a cabinet of billionaires running the US state in the interest of big business and finance. China has a bunch of bureaucrats running the state in the interest, as they see it, of the state and the development of the economy. But the reason that it's successful, and this is the one thing we have to recognize, is the development of a planned economy, still planning in China, and where the state dominates the major sectors of the economy. And so the profitability of the capitalist sector in China is not decisive, as like in other countries, it has proven to be that whenever profitability collapses in those countries, we get crises. That doesn't happen in China. So that's something that we have to preserve. But we don't preserve the dungeons of Syria. We don't preserve the dungeons of Iran. We don't preserve the dungeons and prisons of Putin. And if George Galloway thinks that that's who we should look to, then I think that's not what socialists should approach when they're thinking about the question of what we do defend. We defend the internationalism of the working class, the aim to get rid of capitalism, planned economies, and public investment in the interests of social need.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michael. Absolutely fascinating session. Thank you very much for thoughtful contributions from the floor as well. This is an ongoing subject, no doubt, and we'll probably ask you again in a few months' time. Michael has to finish his book first. I'm really glad to hear he's doing another book. Perhaps we could invite
the slides on the chat for everybody.
Yeah. Perhaps when it's out, we can invite you to do a presentation, and then lots of people.
I hope I'm still alive by the time it's finished. Yeah.
Excellent. Next week, comrades, is the last session of Why Marx this year. We're going to look at Jesus the Revolutionary and what we can learn from him. Thank you very much, comrades. See you.